My dear friends, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger, and today I'm going to talk about music in Viking Age. This was a video suggested by many of my patrons. It's a long list, so I thank you all for your suggestions. Thank you, my dear friends and my dear patrons. Although I would specifically like to dedicate this video to my patron, Soren Addix, who is a musician, and you can enjoy his work at Spotify as well as here on YouTube. Our Stone Halfway House. I'll leave the links down below in the description. And I would also like to dedicate this video to another patron and another friend, Wagner Jaseman, and to his brother as well. Whatever battles that lie ahead, I wish both of you strength of spirit. And as Victor Hugo, the poet, playwright, novelist, and among other things once said, music expresses that which cannot be put into words and that which cannot remain silent. Now, I do hope all of you enjoy this video. Let's get started. So, music during the Viking Age in Scandinavia. There are a couple of factors we must take into consideration before starting this video, and I think you need to understand. I'm going to talk about music in Scandinavian culture during the Viking period, circa 793 to 1066 of the Common Era. So this is the period I'm going to try to cover. Most evidences of Viking Age music in Scandinavia come from the archaeological record. The music instruments, and therefore their physical proof that helps us to understand the types of sound produced by the instruments of that specific period. But of course, the instruments alone won't give us any clues about the music that was performed. And this is an important aspect because music isn't just the combination of instrumental and vocal sounds to form a specific tune. We could argue, obviously, that music is in every culture all over the world. It is true. And if we want to understand Scandinavian music during the Viking period, perhaps we should look at traditional music performed today in Scandinavian countries. And perhaps maybe also take a look at neighboring countries and their music instruments and all that comprises their music. But the problem here is that exactly. As I have said, music isn't just the combination of vocal and instrumental sounds. It also has a lot to do with each cultural background. Everything that encompasses a culture will be expressed in that culture's music. So each type of music in each culture, in each specific period in history, will obviously sound very different, and it will be most appealing to the culture that specific music belongs to. It is the expression of the collective consciousness of that culture, so it forms something unique. So looking at modern folk music of each country and neighboring music and musical instruments don't help that much in understanding the music of the past. Also, this is the Viking period, so the Scandinavian people did not have a written culture during this time yet. I mean, Scandinavians had runes as a form of writing during the Viking Age, progressively evolving to a well-structured writing system precisely during this period. But they did not yet have the writing culture that would later greatly develop after the arrival of Christianity, which is precisely the moment when we get a lot more information, written information, about a variety of subjects. However, other cultures that came in contact with Scandinavians, and vice versa as well, during this period had a written culture we can rely on, more or less, and from there we might have some clues about Scandinavian music during the Viking period. But this also constitutes some problems, because those written sources are the perspective of a culture coming in contact with another culture. It's from their point of view. And because the music of a specific culture contains in it the expression of the collective consciousness of that same culture, what is appealing to some might be absolute garbage to others, because they are not dealing with the same cultural understanding of music, right? Finally, it is important to reflect that in Scandinavia during the Viking period, without a doubt, the Norse people had music in their societies, but music was not the most important artistic expression in Norse culture. Poetry was the most important artistic expression during the Viking period in Scandinavia, as you well know it. And there is often the mistake of comparing the Nordic skald to the bard. In the Gaelic and British culture, the bard certainly composed music and was a storyteller, made verses. But the Nordic skald, however, was a poet. But there are actually no evidences whatsoever that the skalds incorporated in their performances any musical instruments. Poetry has rhythm, but it's not music. It's a completely different form of art, artistic expression, that could be turned into music if we want to. But the skald did not make music. He made poetry without musical instruments and without singing. Reciting is not singing, not unless you create a tune out of your words and add musicality to the voice, right? So, poetry was the most important artistic expression in Viking Age Scandinavia, often recited aloud to an audience. And the importance of an activity is often reflected in the religious panorama of a culture, especially in the pantheon of that culture or perceptions of the divine. The Old Norse people had no deity related to music, no god or goddess of music, as other cultures have. Instead, they had Odin, the god of poetry. And they elevated to deity one of the best skalds, best poets they ever had, Bragi, a real person turned to a god. And also the myth of poetry, and Kvasir, and Galdr, and the whole religious and spiritual panorama revolving around the spoken word, but no music. So this is what you must take in mind. We can say a lot more about poetry in the Viking Age than we can say about music. Remember that this is a period without a written culture in Scandinavia. No one was writing in parchment anything. No one was writing extensively. Only runes in memorial stones expressing mythological accounts, epic tales, dedications, warnings, a lot of subjects from the oral tradition. Music existed in Viking Age Scandinavia, but it wasn't being recorded. Musical notes were not being noted down, and therefore it is easily forgotten, and eventually it disappears, whilst poetry remains in the oral tradition. And it has rhythm, it rhymes sometimes, it has a specific structure, and not to mention, in the Scandinavian case, the use of kennings. So it will be easier to remember, and it remains in living memory longer, until a written culture is established. So it is a difficult subject, but I've tried my best, so let's see what we can come up with. Perhaps we should start with the most archaic and simple, yet effective type of music instrument, which are often called wind instruments, the projection of sound through the vibration of air. In other words, blowing air into the instrument. These are the most common musical instruments found in archaeological contexts. The great majority of wind instruments of the Viking period were made from wood, bone, and horn. Wind musical instruments made of horn are the most common, by far, horns of various types. in Viking Age archaeological contexts, obviously. Now, bear it with me. I'm certain it immediately comes to mind when we are talking about horns as musical instruments, the famous lyre horns. There are the bronze lyre horns from Scandinavian Bronze Age, a period roughly between 1500 to 500 BCE, before the Common Era, and there are the lyre horns made of wood from the Scandinavian Late Iron Age and the Middle Ages, used during roughly 1,000 years, from 400 to until 1400 of the Common Era, more or less that period, so well into the High Middle Ages as well. The Bronze Age lyre horns actually gained this name, lyre horns, because of the later wooden ones, and not the other way around. Interestingly. And the Bronze Age lyres are surprisingly very well crafted. These are often the ones we see in a variety of pictures alluding to the Germanic peoples of the past. And then this instrument is often transported to the imagery of the Viking period, a romantic imagery. Well, these beautiful Bronze Age lyres were not used by the Vikings. The Viking Age and High Middle Age lyres were made of wood, quite simple in their appearance, and the chosen wood was often birch. Obviously, we only start to have written sources about these specific musical instruments, the lyre horns made of wood, in the Icelandic sagas. There we find mentions that these specific instruments were used in a military context, to martial warriors, and of course to intimidate opponents. In peaceful times, however, it was mostly used for sheep herding and to call upon cattle, signaling cattle. Perhaps this reminds us, at least to me, it reminds me of that beautiful painting Op on the fjöldet, toner and lur. Up in the hills, a clarion call rings out from my favorite neo-romanticism artist, Theodor Kiltason. Of course, in the painting, well, perhaps it's not shorter, but a straighter lyre horn, or so it seems, when compared to the ones from the Viking Age, which were about 1 meter long. Although, of course, the size must have been quite different, depending on the purpose and from man to man. Just kidding. But perhaps in a war situation, they may have been bigger, I'm assuming, at least the ones to martial troops. The Viking Age wooden lyre horns are indeed quite similar to the Scandinavian modern herding lyres, as you can see from this picture somewhere in here. Although the modern ones are covered with birch bark, whilst the Viking Age ones had no such protection, it seems, and were simply carved out of wood, probably one big piece carved from one single tree trunk. Then we have wind musical instruments made of actual animal horns, and various instruments carved from cow horn have been found. Usually the tip of the horn is the mouthpiece, and you blow into it. And along the body of the horn, 4 holes were made to place the fingers, like a sort of flute. Typically it's 4 small finger holes, but there are a few cases with 5. But it seems that 4 was the preferable amount of holes. There are also very interesting types of horn as musical instruments, often called jam's horn, where the mouthpiece is precisely on the opposite end. On the wider end, such horns have a wooden stopper that plugs the space around the mouthpiece. However, it isn't clear yet if the Vikings used these ones, since the earliest findings related to this type of horn dates from the early 16th century, well after the Viking period. Still, I think it's worth the mention. Of course, the Vikings also used bone flutes, one of the most ancient types of wind musical instruments. bone flutes have been found all over Scandinavia. Viking Age flutes were typically carved from the bones of cows, deer, large birds and sheep bones as well, or from wood, typically from the branches of alder tree. These flutes vary in size from simple whistles to longer flutes with multiple finger holes. These flutes have a mouthpiece you would insert into the bone, usually a fipple made of wood or bone. So these were composed by two elements, the body and the mouthpiece. And finally, on the category of wind music instruments, we have the so-called panpipes. I'll show you the examples somewhere around here. They are made out of boxwood and resemble slab of thin regular wood that have 5 holes drilled into it alongside its vertical length. These instruments are from the Viking Age indeed, but so far they have only been found in the Coppergate excavations in York, UK, dating to the 10th century. This might have been a local thing, perhaps Roman influence. As you know, York was once the Roman city of Eboracum, the capital of the Roman province of Britannia Inferior. The panpipes might indeed be a classical influence that remained in the area, and the Vikings continued this tradition in their own way when they have captured the city in the 9th century. And so Viking York, Jorvik, thrived under Viking rule until in mid-10th century Eric Bloodaxe was kicked out by King Idrid. Now, do be careful. This is the moment I tell you to please read more books from reliable academic sources because the internet is very useful, there is no doubt about that, but filled with mistakes and also false information as well. I found out a couple of websites showing this particular picture here of these beautiful panpipes with a horse head carved on the piece, saying that these are from the Viking Age. Well, they are not. These are panpipes from Portugal and Spain. And I know this because I live and work in Portugal, and these panpipes are still being used by those who continue the dying tradition of sharpening people's knives. They go into the streets, call out in this instrument, a very typical sound and always the same tune, and those who want to sharpen their knives and other tools come to them. Finally, we have the Foster pipe, a wind instrument found during an excavation at Frobrodr. It was found part of an instrument during the excavations of a shipyard at the Fribrodr River on Foster, Denmark. This is why it is called Foster pipe, because it's from Foster. It might have been part of a bagpipe, but there is no evidence to support this theory, however. On the modern replica you see here, a wooden mouthpiece was added, as well as a bell-like piece at the end, making the instrument into a sort of hornpipe. If it was indeed like this, we have no idea. The finding was from the later part of the 11th century, between 1050 and 1100 of the Common Era, according to the dating of the material. Now, moving on to string instruments, the production of sound through the vibration of strings, obviously. Now, when it comes to string instruments, unfortunately, we can hardly rely on archaeology because only very few examples have survived. But fortunately, in Norse literature, we have mentions of the harp and the lyre, which seem to have been the most used string musical instruments in the Old Norse culture. The best example of a Viking Age lyre is perhaps the Sutton Hoo example in the southeast of England, and several replicas have been made to try to understand how it worked and how it sounded. Sorry, when I said Viking Age right now, I'm referring to the exact same period as this particular archaeological finding. As you know, Sutton Hoo is Anglo-Saxon, and this lyre is Anglo-Saxon, right? It dates approximately between the 6th and the 7th century. However, the shape of this lyre matches the shape of other lyres found outside England and in continental Europe as well during the same period. So it would not differ that much from culture to culture at this period in Europe. I'm going to show you now an example, the Kravik lyre, dating from the 13th century. This is the only preserved medieval lyre in the Nordic countries. It has the same shape as the lyre carved on the Hilstad Stave church portal door from Stedesdal, Norway, which you can see in here in more detail, dating from the 12th century. The carving illustrates a scene from the story of Siegfried, and here we see Gunther, who dies in the snake pit playing the harp with his toes. This type of lyre has been used in Norway at least since the late Middle Ages up until the 19th century. Not in use during the Viking period, but it's quite possible that this model followed previous models of earlier periods. So quite possibly during the Viking period the lyre would be quite similar to this example of the Kravik lyre. Mostly what we know from Viking Age harps and lyres actually come from a few depictions on manuscripts. The harp in Scandinavian context is by far the most depicted instrument in the written sources, and also in wood carvings as well as stone carvings, most of which is precisely the example I've shown you, the famous scene from Volsunga Saga, Gunnar playing the harp in the snake pit. And no, I'm not forgetting that I've called the instrument a lyre before, previously, and now I'm saying it's a harp. I'm doing this on purpose. The written sources describe it to be an harp played by Gunnar. But as you can see, this illustration on wood, as well as other illustrations, other carvings on stone as well, show a lyre type of instrument. There is, of course, the case of the fiddle and the gigi. The latter, I don't know how you say it in English, if there is indeed a word for it in English. I think it's giga or giga, was a type of bowed lyre considered to be extinct. The name gigi originates from Old Norse, meaning to vibrate and to move in a fast way. You would play this lyre probably the same way you would play an Icelandic fiddle. These instruments were very important among Scandinavians, and you can find them all across Scandinavia. It also includes parts of England, Iceland, and of course Denmark. But this type of instrument isn't indigenous to Scandinavia, and it was most likely, well, obviously, a foreign import. Through my research, I had a hard time trying to find a gigi, the bowed lyre, until I realized, unfortunately, it isn't actually known what a gigi looked like, because simply none has ever been found, and it's solely referred to in the written sources. It's clearly a lyre. It has strings, obviously, and often comes together with the fiddle. So both string instruments played like a sort of violin. They are always, or quite often, mentioned together in Old Norse sources. You are probably thinking right now about the famous kantele, the kantele musical instrument, but that's from Finland, which may indeed have influenced the previous Scandinavian instruments I have spoken of. Finland indeed has a rich musical heritage, and the kantele is an important string musical instrument. You play it by plucking the strings. In the Finnish Kalevala epic, the shaman craftsman Venemoinen crafted the first kantele harp out of the skull of an enormous pikefish and strung it with strings spun from a woman's hair. The original instrument was lost at sea, so Venemoinen fashioned a new one from the wood of a birch tree. Traditional kanteles are made from a hollowed-out block of wood and have 5 horsehair strings. Of course, the strings were replaced by wire when it began to be manufactured industrially. Of course, this video cannot come to an end just yet without speaking of percussion instruments. Let's start with the rattle. Possibly the most famous rattle ever found in Scandinavian archaeological context is the Osberg rattle, which was discovered protruding from a dragon's head. Supposedly the rattle was fastened to a rope, which again was put into one of the dragon's mouth. This has often been interpreted as a sort of, or having a sort of connection to ritualistic processions, where the rattles would have been carried together with the dragon's heads. The Osberg rattles are in fact slightly different than the other rattles found in other archaeological contexts, because these specific ones, are ornamented, inlaid with gold and silver, and the larger of the two have exceptionally many soundings. Rattles have been referred to in connection with pagan ritualistic practices in written sources, such as in Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote about jingling or rattling in association with the worship of Freyr. Apparently, Saxo Grammaticus was in Sweden and he witnessed firsthand the sacrifices and celebrations to the god Freyr. And he was, as he said, disgusted by the feminine gestures of the male participants and by the unmanly clatter of the bells. Whatever were his homophobic thoughts, well, he was a Christian, he does mention bells and rattling sounds. So it's a type of noisemaker instrument, the one found in the Osberg ship burial, probably to announce the funerary procession. Or maybe indeed they were played and produced a typical sound or maybe a typical song, music in ritualistic performances. If we take into consideration that the woman buried in the Osberg ship was considered to be a vulva, or perhaps a priestess of Freya, well, she was indeed a woman with high social status, high rank, and it was not uncommon at all members of nobility linked to the cult of Freya, and that is well documented actually. So it might be that she used this metal rattle in some performance, in some sort of rituals. And of course, speaking of rituals, we have another percussion instrument, the drum. The drum is probably the most likely the oldest known vocal, we might say, artificial production of sound, and as universal as you can get. Now, the drum, mostly the frame drum, is well known as the sacred instrument of the shaman. Norse people during the Viking Age almost certainly knew about this instrument, judging by the amount of neighboring peoples at that time whose cultures were still very shamanic in nature, and the use of the drum by shamans was constant. By the peoples of Lapland, for instance, the well-known Sami drum, but also, of course, the Celtic brodram, frame drum. Yet, it's strange that there have been no drums found belonging to the Germanic Scandinavians. At all. Viking Age Scandinavians most certainly knew about these drums, Yet we do not find them in Scandinavian archaeology, outside Lapland. There are some literary accounts, namely from Ibn Fadlan, that suggest that the Vikings may have used their shields as drum substitutes during certain rituals, but no actual drums at all. Although, I must say, there is an interesting Greek account in terms of possible drums used by Germanic peoples, from the Greek historian Strabo. We are talking about the beginning of the 1st century, so far before the time of the Vikings. But he particularly mentions a type of drum used by Germanic peoples, making sound by beating on hides that were stretched all around the wicker bodies of wagons during a battle. So it's likely that Germanic peoples had a type of drum-like instrument composed of stretched animal hides, and maybe 7 centuries later the Vikings would have this kind of drum-like instrument, a stretched animal hide on some surface or wooden structure, which obviously deteriorates faster than a regular drum from other cultures, such as the Sami drums, and maybe this is one of the reasons why no such Viking drums have ever been found. I previously spoke about the Osberg lady, who was, without a doubt, an important figure to the Viking period society of that time and linked to the cult of Freya. So maybe either a Volva or a priestess of Freya, which, as I've said, it wasn't uncommon to find members of the nobility linked to specific cults of specific deities. In fact, most celebrations and festivities concerning the cult of a specific deity, it was up to the members of the nobility to perform the rituals. Nobility held the religious power. However, it must be noted, and I've said this before many times, mind that the Volva is not to be confused with the shaman. The Volva seems to perform certain aspects within shamanism, but not fully shamanism. In shamanism, dancing and drumming are generally used by shamans to induce a state of ecstasy, and the great majority of ceremonies are for healing purposes. And the Volva's purpose in her ceremonies was never concerning healing, but divination. She was a prophetess, after all. In Old Norse accounts of Seidr, there isn't any reference to drumming or dancing. Nothing of it. Just singing. And the song is performed by specific people forming a sort of choir and are the followers of the Volva. So the picture we nowadays have of the Volva and Seidr with drums and dancing and healing purposes is obviously incorrect. The Volva was not a healer, and drums and dancing were not part of Seidr rites. Seidr was essentially a divination ceremony, and sometimes used for hostile purposes as well. It is implied in a number of accounts that the Volva obtained her knowledge while in a trance state, but that trance state was not induced by drumming. Moreover, the Volva was surrounded by a number of singers, a kind of choir, who chanted the incantation required. Most likely the songs performed were to induce a trance state and also to awake the Volva from her trance. But I will talk about that in more detail when I do a video about the song called Vardlokur. However, there are plenty of literary references to drums, but no physical drum has ever been found in Viking Age archaeological contexts. What we can say for sure is that the people of the Viking Age, in Scandinavia were indeed very fond of wind musical instruments and strings as well. Without a doubt, Vikings played musical instruments. Ah yes, I almost forgot. There was one other musical instrument from the Viking Age which produced a very sharp sound by clapping hands. In Viking Age archaeological context, Viking hands have been found. Several long, thin fingers and a lot of small little bones. I'm just messing with you, obviously. But indeed, clapping also produces sound and can be turned into a rhythm and produce a sort of tune, and worked the same way as the rattles, noisemakers. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag!